They were less than a block from the hospital. Clear skies, no weather, almost no wind, a routine air ambulance flight with an experienced pilot on a landing pad that he had been to before. And then the helicopter started to spin. Not slowly, not controllably, but violently. And in less than 10 seconds, everything was over. This is the story of an Air Evac Lifeteam flight in a Bell 206 medical helicopter that crashed in Wichita Falls, Texas on October 4th, 2014. This isn't going to be just an aviation story. This is an EMS story, a human story, because the people responding to this crash were responding to their own crew. Full story coming up on this episode of the Dr. Medic. Now, the operator for this flight was Air Evac Lifeteam, one of the world's largest air ambulance providers with over 150 bases, hundreds of aircraft across 10 states, and well over 1,000 employees. Air Evac historically has operated on a business model that included utilizing the same airframe across their entire fleet with the Bell 206. Now, back in 2014, nearly 100% of their fleet were still Bell 206s. Now, this has changed a bit today with more Bell 407s. I think they have a handful of EC-130s and even a few Airbus EC-135s. But even today, the core of their fleet are still Bell 206s. Now, this specific aircraft in this accident was this Bell 206 Long Ranger L1 with tail number November 335 Alpha Echo. Now, the Bell 206 Jet Ranger was originally developed for the U.S. Navy and U.S. Army back in the early 1960s, with the stretched version, the Long Ranger, being developed in the mid-1970s, and this exact aircraft in this accident was actually manufactured way back in 1981 and had accumulated 18,378 hours on the airframe. Now, later variants of the Long Ranger were developed, such as the L3 and the L4, with slightly more horsepower and strengthened structural components, including an improved transmission capable of handling the additional power. Now, older versions of the Long Ranger, such as the L1 in this crash, were available to be upgraded to the same specs as the L4, which is exactly what Air Evac did with this aircraft, which gives it the official title as a Bell 206 L1 Plus, with the plus indicating that the aircraft has been upgraded. Now, the pilot in this accident was 36-year-old Zachariah Smith, who we will just refer to as Pilot Zach. Now, Pilot Zach held a commercial helicopter pilot's license and was instrument rated for rotor wing. He had a total of 1,584 hours of helicopter time, with 214 of those hours in the Bell 206 and the overwhelming majority of the other hours in a CH-47 Chinook, which is the famous tandem rotor helicopter operated by many militaries around the world, with the biggest operator being the United States Army. Now, at the time of this accident, Pilot Zach had been employed with Air Evac Lifeteam for less than 4 months. The weather during these early morning hours could not have been better. We have clear skies. The winds are just about 3 knots out of the south, with a temperature of 51 degrees Fahrenheit and a dew point of 33 degrees Fahrenheit. Beautiful early morning. The flight nurse on this flight was Leslie Stewart, just 27 years old and an ICU nurse at Duncan Regional Hospital. Now, Leslie had been married for about 2 years and had just been hired at Air Evac a few months prior to this crash. The flight paramedic was 51-year-old Johan Vanderkolf, who emigrated to the U.S. by way of Cape Town, South Africa, became a U.S. citizen, and then proudly represented this country by serving in the United States Army and then the Texas National Guard. Johan was a proud father and worked as a flight paramedic for nearly 15 years. So this Duncan-based crew, they catch a flight to transfer a patient from the tiny little community hospital in the tiny little town of Waurika, Oklahoma. Now, it's about a 30-mile flight from Duncan down to Waurika and another 35 miles from Waurika down to United Regional Hospital, which is located in Wichita Falls, Texas. Now, they are transferring this patient to this hospital because the patient has a reported gunshot wound to the head, and he requires that rapid intervention and treatment from United Regional, as they are a level 2 trauma center. Being a trauma center, United Regional obviously has a helicopter landing pad, but this one is a bit unique. You see, this pad is actually located across the street from the hospital and is sort of coupled with another Air Evac Lifeteam base. In this case, Air Evac Lifeteam base number 34. And you can see the pad in Air Evac's hangar and living quarters here, as this base is still in the same location today. Even though Air Evac 34 is based here at United Regional, it is certainly not uncommon for other helicopters, especially Air Evac Lifeteam helicopters, to also transport patients into this particular hospital and land at this pad right in front of Air Evac 34's base. And when these other helicopters do so, it is certainly not uncommon for the Air Evac 34 crew members, including the pilot, the nurse, and/or the paramedic, to go outside and help the landing crew with the logistics of the patient. You see, with the Bell 206, it is a tiny little helicopter, and it does not have its own stretcher system. All patient transports on Bell 206s will require the patient to be moved from the helicopter litter system over to either a hospital bed or an EMS stretcher, and that process, it can be quite difficult sometimes, and extra hands are always welcome. So the Duncan crew flies to Waurika. They pick up their patient, and they are now headed to United Regional in Wichita Falls. And by this point, it's about 1:55 in the morning. Everything is normal. The weather is perfect, clear skies, visibility 10 miles. Like I said, winds are about 3 knots. This is the kind of flight no one thinks twice about. Pilot Zach sets up for his approach to the helipad at United Regional. He approaches from the northwest at about 700 feet above the ground. He's familiar with this pad. He's landed here before. It's a little tricky to land at this pad from the north, as the pad is essentially surrounded on all sides by obstructions, especially the north side. His night vision goggles are up, which is perfectly normal, as the hospital lighting is too bright for the NVGs. He runs his checklist, everything looks good, but as he gets closer, he thinks he's a little high and a little fast. He would later say specifically about 12 to 15 knots too fast. So he makes the call. He aborts the approach and states his intentions to perform a go-around and attempt the landing again. Just after he makes this call, he adds power, tips the nose forward, and he tries to regain some airspeed. And just as he pulls collective, the helicopter snaps into a right spin. He later describes it as violent, the fastest he has ever spun. He tells the crew to hold on and tries to fight it by inputting some left pedal and some cyclic. Nothing works. Helicopter just keeps spinning. Inside the crew quarters, the Air Evac 34 crew are awake. They had flown several flights that evening on their own, including doing a football drop at a local high school football game. Either way, they are still awake and completing some paperwork when the flight paramedic hears the incoming helicopter. Remember, they're getting ready to go outside and assist with moving the patient. Now, the Wichita Falls pilot, he opens up the door to the pad and he hears a change in rotor noise, then a snap, a bang, and then silence. The Wichita Falls paramedic later says, "I heard the helicopter, then nothing. Then the lights flickered in the base for about 10 seconds. Now, just on the north side of the base, the helicopter spins multiple times. They clip power lines, and that impact with the power lines completely destabilizes everything. The aircraft flips and slams into the ground, inverted just about 1 block from the hospital. And then, about 6 seconds later, there's an explosion. Here's where things become a bit different. Because the people responding aren't just EMS, they're their coworkers. Now, all 3 Wichita Falls crew members run outside, look down the street, and see a giant fireball. They run a full block towards the crash and sort of split up as they move around the burning aircraft. Now, Air Evac 34 pilot Jason, he finds flight nurse Leslie. She's literally still on fire. He uses his own jacket to put the flames out, burning his own arm in the process and sustaining his own second-degree burns. The Air Evac 34 flight paramedic Johnny finds the Duncan flight paramedic Johan lying in the street, also on fire, and sees a bystander trying to put the flames out with a shirt. Now, Base 34 flight nurse Aaron is a few moments behind and heads towards pilot Zach, who is trying to crawl out of the front windshield of the burning helicopter. But as he approaches the helicopter, he sees flight nurse Leslie lying on the ground a few feet away from him. She's not moving, and he thinks that she's dead. And then she screams, "Help me." Now, flight nurse Aaron finally makes his way to pilot Zach, who again appears kind of stuck in the front of the helicopter, which, remember, at this point, the helicopter is upside down and is completely on fire just behind the pilot's seat. The helicopter is still making some type of noise, fuel is leaking, and the fire is only growing larger. Aaron is moving between patients. He's dragging the pilot away from the wreckage and yelling, "Dude, you gotta get up and go. Let's go." The fire is right behind them. Flight nurse Aaron then makes his way over to the injured flight paramedic, and at first, he doesn't even realize that the Duncan flight paramedic, Johan, is actually his full-time partner at this Wichita Falls base. He doesn't realize it until he gets closer, hears his voice, and recognizes him. You see, the Wichita Falls base was Johan's full-time base, and he was simply working an overtime shift up at the Duncan base. Now, Johan can't see Aaron because his burns are so severe, but he hears Aaron and calls his name. And at this point, while the flight crew is trying to figure out what to do, Johan just has one thing to say: "Call my son." Now, this Wichita Falls crew wants to get these patients over to the hospital, but there are no stretchers at first. They send people back to the ER to get them. They're improvising. It's chaotic. It's loud. People are screaming, and the helicopter is still burning behind them. Local EMS shows up, and by this time, there are hospital and EMS stretchers, and both flight nurse Leslie and flight paramedic Johan are literally wheeled a block down the street and straight into the United Regional Emergency Department. Now, pilot Zach, he survives with a fractured neck, a clavicle injury, and cuts to his hands, but no burns. Later, when asked what happened, he says, "I don't know." So what actually did happen? The NTSB obviously did an extremely thorough investigation. There was no evidence of mechanical failure, no evidence of an engine issue, no drugs, no alcohol. Nothing appeared to break. This was aerodynamic, something called loss of tail rotor effectiveness, or LTE. And this is not the only time that LTE has led to a fatal helicopter accident with Air Evac Lifeteam. Now, the NTSB has published safety alerts for loss of tail rotor effectiveness, with the most recent alert being published in 2017, and warns that loss of tail rotor effectiveness can occur in all single-engine helicopters with tail rotors at speeds less than 30 knots. At low airspeed, the tail rotor is responsible for nearly 100% of the directional control of the helicopter. It controls the yaw by providing sideways thrust to counteract the rotational forces that the engine is placing on the main rotor. You all have probably heard this before, but without the tail rotor on a regular helicopter, the power and the torque of the engine would just spin the aircraft around instead of spinning the main rotor around. So helicopters have a tail rotor to counteract this force. Now, when most helicopters are flying forward, they gain a lot of aerodynamic assistance from that forward airspeed to essentially kind of weather vane the tail boom and keep the aircraft straight. And there are even some helicopters where the tail rotor is essentially providing very little anti-torque thrust while flying forward at cruising speed. But the less forward speed the helicopter has, the more the tail rotor comes into play. Now, when pilot Zach added power through the main rotors to perform his go-round, he increased torque, but he didn't yet have enough airspeed to stabilize the aircraft. So the helicopter did exactly what physics says it will do. It yawed hard to the right. And once it started developing at low altitude, recovery becomes extremely difficult. In a sense, most helicopters only have so much total power or torque available through the transmission system, and that torque is displayed on a pilot's gauge as a torque percentage with a typical maximum of 99 or 100%. Now, if a pilot exceeds that torque or over-torques the aircraft, that means that the torque limits of the drivetrain, and more importantly, the transmission, have likely been exceeded, and the helicopter will now most likely have to be checked for damage, and in many cases might have major components replaced at an extremely high cost. So kind of like the 10-second lesson here is that helicopters have a limited amount of torque or power. And if you are already at 99 or 100% torque on your gauge while they're landing, and then you increase the torque by sending more power through the collective to the main rotor or through the pedals to the tail rotor, then you will have to reduce torque or power somewhere else. In this case, pilot Zach was most likely already at or near maximum torque as he was on final approach for landing and with very little forward airspeed. When he attempted to do his go-round, he increased collective and torque demand increased dramatically. But at the same time, the helicopter was slow. It was high power and operating in conditions where the tail rotor could no longer generate enough anti-torque thrust to stop the yaw. So the tail rotor could no longer counteract the helicopter's natural tendency to rotate opposite the main rotor. So the helicopter started to spin. He tried to recover, and according to the NTSB investigation, he did add left pedal to increase tail rotor thrust, but not full pedal. And by the time the spin fully developed, there wasn't enough altitude to get out of it. He was already so low that there was no way to gain any forward airspeed. Now, it's possible that pilot Zach's only option would have been to jam full left pedal and hope that would have controlled the spin. But he didn't. Why? At this point, 12 years later, we can only speculate, but we do know that pilot Zach was quite proficient in the CH-47 Chinook. And guess what the Chinook doesn't have? A tail rotor. Yes, it still has pedals, which still control yaw through differential rotor thrust, but when you are taking off and landing in a Chinook, guess how much pedal you are using for anti-torque? 0. Now, tandem rotor aircraft like the CH-47 operate very differently during hover and low-speed flight compared to single rotor helicopters. And as I have discussed on this channel before, transitioning from one helicopter to another is not always as simple as just completing differences training. It may take more time. We also know that pilot Zach, while he did mention that he had landed at this pad before, he also mentioned that he had never landed there at night. Now, pilot Zach did successfully complete ground school with Air Evac Lifeteam with almost 11 hours of flight training, which did include, among other things, training for loss of tail rotor effectiveness. Also important to point out that pilot Zach had just over 1,500 total flight hours when he was hired at Air Evac a few months prior. And at the time, what was the minimum flight hours required to get hired with Air Evac? 1,500 hours. Not too long after this crash, Air Evac began requiring a minimum of 2,000 hours of flight time as a condition of getting hired. But in my opinion, here's the part that matters most. The crash itself was likely survivable, but the fire was not. This helicopter was built in 1981 and did not have a crash-resistant fuel system. Now, we don't normally talk about the Bell 206s and 407s when we're talking about these crash-resistant fuel systems, as we are usually talking about something, in the AS350, H125, EC130 family, as those aircraft, when not appropriately equipped, actually had fuel tanks that would crack and spill fuel everywhere when the aircraft crashes. But Bell 206s and 407s never really had that problem, because they were essentially designed with the military in mind and have typically always had crash-resistant fuel bladders inside their fuel tanks. However, when we discuss crash resistance for fuel on these helicopters, we are not just talking about the fuel tank itself. We are also talking about the entire fuel system, especially the fuel fittings where the fuel lines come in and out of the fuel tank and the fuel pumps. So while this 206 did have a good fuel tank, it did not have crash-resistant fuel fittings. And when it crashed, the fuel lines separated. Fuel kept flowing. But remember, this aircraft was inverted. And guess where the fuel tank and the fuel pumps are located on a Bell 206? Well, there are actually 2 forward fuel cells, but the fuel from those cells is essentially pumped back to the main fuel tank, which sits directly under the med crew seats with the tank wrapping around behind them. So when these fuel lines and fittings became separated, fuel would have continued to flow from the forward tanks directly into the cabin, where flight paramedic Johan and flight nurse Leslie would have been sitting. Then came ignition, quite possibly from the arcing power lines that the helicopter crashed into. And then all of that fuel caught on fire, including the aircraft and both Leslie and Johan. So what was the NTSB's probable cause finding here? The pilot's failure to maintain yaw control when he applied power to execute a go-around at low airspeed in dark night conditions, which resulted in a rapid, uncommanded right yaw due to a loss of tail rotor effectiveness. Now, the NTSB later made a safety recommendation because of this particular crash, because this wasn't unique. This was a pattern. Survivable crashes turning fatal because of a post-crash fire. But because the aircraft was manufactured back in 1981, the updated crash-resistant fuel system was not made mandatory and was only put out as a safety recommendation. Being that the backbone of the Air Evac Lifeteam was and still is the Bell 206, I feel that this is an important safety concern to discuss. Now, I did reach out to Air Evac Lifeteam prior to publishing this story and specifically asked them how many 206 L1s they have left in their fleet, and if they do remain in the fleet, have they all been updated with fully functioning crash-resistant fuel systems that include breakaway fittings to prevent fuel from flowing in case of a crash. Now, at the time of this video being published, I have not received a response. Now, as I said, pilot Zach lived, but both of the med crew were immediately flown on other Air Evac Lifeteam aircraft to Parkland Medical Center in Dallas, Texas for burn treatment. Flight nurse Leslie survived initially, but died just a few days later. Flight paramedic Johan, he also initially survived, but sadly, he also died, this time several weeks later. The patient they were transporting also died. 3 lives lost, 1 survivor. Now, I don't think this was recklessness. I don't think this was even a bad pilot. This was a trained professional making a split-second decision in a routine situation in perfect weather and still losing control. But could the pilot have jammed full left pedal even if it meant over-torquing the aircraft? Yes, he could have. And from what I understand, even though Air Evac provided training on LTE during ground school, they took this opportunity after this crash to re-educate and re-emphasize the potential safety hazard from LTE in their Bell 206s, and even emphasized to pilots that if avoiding LTE requires temporarily exceeding torque limits, then by all means, over-torque the aircraft and get on the ground safely. Some have speculated over the years that the Bell 206 itself is underpowered and or somehow unsafe. Now, this topic is certainly treading into some highly contentious waters. Is the Bell 206 necessarily the best airframe for air medical operations? I'm going to save that answer and leave you all hanging on that one until a future video, as that's sort of a different question related to this story. You see, in the NTSB's original safety recommendation on LTE, they specifically called out single-engine helicopters as being susceptible to LTE. Now, that may lead the average reader to interpret that to mean that somehow LTE can only occur in a single-engine aircraft, which is certainly not the case. All helicopters with a tail rotor are susceptible to LTE regardless of how much power they have or how many engines they have. As with most research, it comes down to the numbers and properly interpreting those numbers. In this case, single-engine light helicopters such as the Robinson R-22 and R-44, all of the MD-500 variants, AS-350s, H-125s, and yes, of course, the Bell 206, are everywhere. And they far outnumber the amount of twin-engine or tandem rotor helicopters that exist. Now, these single-engine lights are also used more heavily in low-speed operations, such as power line work or news coverage, or even some stuff that's done in EMS. So yes, LTE occurs more often in these aircraft, including the 206. In addition, many of the larger medium-lift twins that we might see in EMS, such as a Bell 412, H-135s, 145s, or even AW-139s, are most likely also going to be accompanied by, more complex and more expensive systems such as a FADEC or stability augmentation systems, autopilot systems. They may have larger vertical stabilizers and probably even have more powerful tail rotor systems in itself. So lest someone interpret the NTSB recommendation to mean that somehow a single-engine light helicopter is more susceptible to LTE simply because it is a single engine, just know that the statistics are far more nuanced than that. And could a fully functioning crash-resistant fuel system have prevented the burn injuries on flight nurse Leslie and flight paramedic Johan? Probably so. So much so that the NTSB put out a safety recommendation just because of this crash. In the end, this was a routine landing. A split-second decision took place. A mistake that, given a certain set of circumstances, could happen to almost any pilot. Maybe more experience would have changed the outcome. Maybe it wouldn't have. But by the end of the night, 3 people were dead. 1 pilot survived, carrying those memories forever, and 3 more crew members were left physically and emotionally scarred after running towards a burning helicopter to try and save their friends. The spin caused the crash, but the fire is what destroyed everyone's lives. And that is why crash-resistant fuel systems matter. The uncomfortable truth is that aviation safety is often built upon the wreckage of past accidents, where lessons written in tragedy eventually become the procedures that save lives later. Investigators were willing to study these mistakes and publish their findings, and here on this channel, we have to be willing to talk about them openly and honestly so the entire industry can continue learning from them. No topic should be off limits. The tragedies of the past, like losing Leslie and Johan, only have meaning if it helps protect the future. Until next time, y'all keep doing amazing stuff. Never stop learning.